In this episode, I talk with Dr. Jim McDavid, who is Professor Emeritus at the School of Public Administration, University of Victoria, which he joined as faculty in 1980. Jim was a recipient of the University of Victoria Alumni Teaching Award and received the University of Victoria's highest academic honor, the UVic Distinguished Professorship Award. He's contributed greatly to the field of evaluation, and the reason why I reached out to him relates to his work tying mindfulness and evaluation together. We cited his work on the relevance of mindfulness to evaluation in our paper published in the American Journal of Evaluation titled Supporting Evaluation Practice Through Mindfulness. Also, he recently co-authored a chapter in the book Practical Wisdom for an Ethical Evaluation Practice that was titled Mindfulness and Practical Wisdom for Evaluators. During this episode, we talk about Jim's experience with mindfulness and meditation practice, how it's influenced him, and how it affects how he views and practices evaluation. Regardless of whether you might be someone who's just sort of starting out as an evaluator or someone who's very experienced, I think that the experiences, the suggestions, the ideas he conveys have a ton of utility and can inform your work. Our conversation covers a lot during this podcast episode. We talk about practical wisdom, Jim's interest in the environment, and challenges associated with determining cause and effect in evaluation. Really grateful for Jim for the time that he spent with me here talking about these things, and grateful for our discussion. Enjoy the episode.
Yeah, Jim, thanks for joining me. I wanted to ask you first off, wanted to talk with you a little bit about mindfulness and its relationship to evaluation. Could you speak to me about your definition of mindfulness?
Well, I have to say that the way I came to mindfulness does make a difference to how I define it. I started out using, or at least being inducted into transcendental meditation, and that was more or less just a graduate student thing that I was doing way back when. Since I've gotten more interested in mindfulness and its connections to evaluation, the definition I like to use is Jon Kabat-Zinn's definition, and really he evolved his definition over time. I think his first version of it was focused primarily on paying attention in the moment. The idea being that you have some sort of object or process, a mantra, or perhaps your breath or your body, and you use that as a vehicle for focusing your attention, and that becomes a means by which you differentiate between what you're focusing on and all the thoughts and feelings that kind of run through your mind. And so that definition of mindfulness, I would think, is sort of the basic version that I use. But the thing about it that's important is that it's primarily secular. It doesn't necessarily attach itself to any philosophical or even religious history of mindfulness. And of course, mindfulness is not something that was invented in the United States in the 1970s when Kabat-Zinn brought it in. It is a very important tradition in the East, thousands of years. So in the original version, as I said, it was more or less intended to be instrumental. And the version that I like to use now is you take that original version, then you add on to it what I would call the values, and to some extent the commitments that go together with practicing mindfulness, which is not only paying attention in the moment and doing those kinds of things on a regular basis, but frankly, a commitment to being compassionate, doing no harm in the world. That can mean a whole lot of different things, but I think it does influence the way that we work as evaluators, as well as the way we work personally. And the idea of taking the sort of what I would call the ethical dimension of mindfulness and elevating that so that it becomes more important in one's practice. So, long and short of it is my own definition of mindfulness continues to evolve. The longer I practice it, the more I find that the ethical dimension becomes more important in relation to the actual practice.
The ethical dimension, how does the ethical dimension emerge? How is it related to the practice of mindfulness? Is it there that when you practice mindfulness, then there's a certain honesty, a certain way in which you act that sort of emerges from kind of really just noticing things in a what's going on in a non-judgmental way and so forth, or like how do those things tie in? Because I've heard that as well, and I heard Kabat-Zinn kind of bring that in and others as well. Yeah, the ethical piece, the ethics. Yeah.
Well, I think the connection for me, James, is the idea of mindfulness and mindfulness practice. And if you start thinking about the connections with its ethical roots or its ethical context, has to do with suffering. Now, that's a very broad word, but basically, the way I have interpreted suffering is that you work in the world and you do no harm. And that really means that you have to be mindful of how you interact with others. Compassion is a very important value. When you look at mindfulness from that point of view, there's lots and lots of stuff written about compassion, but basically it means having a sense of being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And all religions, virtually all major religions in the world, have some version of the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You can word that in the negative, but basically it comes down to being able to put yourself where the other person is and think and act accordingly, so that instead of just reacting. And here the connection, I think, is important, because when you're practicing mindfulness, at least when I'm practicing mindfulness, thoughts, feelings, all these things go through your mind. The practice is intended to create some sense of distance between all that stuff that goes on in your mind and the practice itself. So it's almost as if you're trying to differentiate between the things that produce suffering in your own life and the practice of mindfulness. And, there's all kinds of stuff written about human happiness. The pursuit of happiness is built into the way Americans think about themselves, even politically. But the people who practice mindfulness tend to think of happiness more as not suffering, not being attached to things, either positively or negatively.
So you were talking earlier about your experience with meditation and with your own practice kind of earlier on. Could you kind of walk us through that? You've had your own practice for quite a while. How has that evolved over time? Could you maybe say that a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah. My practice has been on and off over all the years that I've been meditating. I would say that it's evolved more towards a commitment to a lifestyle. Not eating meat, for example, is just one thing. I grew up on a farm in central Alberta where meat and potatoes was it. And so for me, the switch to moving away from meat is just one indication of recognizing that the critters that we farm, and particularly industrial farming, the kind of suffering that happens in that whole life cycle is something that, if you can think of it from an ethical point of view, we each of us have an individual responsibility for reducing suffering. So that's just one small way that I try to reduce suffering. So over time, my practice has moved from, initially it was transcendental meditation. I did that off and on for 30 years. And then more recently, I attended a 10-day retreat where I learned the basics of Vipassana meditation. And that was really quite extraordinary. Being able to experience Vipassana, being able to meditate 8-10 hours a day for 10 days is really quite unique. And most of us, even when we practice, we meditate 2 hours a day, maybe less. And so the intensity really does make a difference in how you see the potential for that kind of practice. And so that's what I'm doing right now. And I find that each meditation is different. There's no sort of pattern. I try not to compare them, even though as an evaluator, my instinct is always to judge. And so suspending judgment, even in my own meditation practice, has become a very important part of how I see the evolution of my practice.
Mm. So you've noticed that a pattern come up. That's something you've noticed, sort of your awareness of that inclination. Could you speak to the difference between transcendental meditation and Vipassana meditation? What was the TM? Was it like mantra meditation? And then can you explain kind of the differences and maybe how one your experience of the maybe the differences or how they're related in your life? Yeah.
Sure. For me, transcendental meditation is primarily in your mind. When you're inducted into transcendental meditation, at least when I was inducted into transcendental meditation as a graduate student, you get a mantra. You're supposed to keep the mantra to yourself. You never forget the mantra. I still know my mantra, but it is a practice, 20 minutes, in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon. It does involve focusing on the mantra. There's a very important difference between focusing and forcing. And that's a general principle of meditation practice, at least from my point of view. You don't force thoughts out of your own mind. You go with the mantra. The mantra takes you in a variety of different ways, and you gently come back to the mantra, even though you're often distracted. So that was my experience with transcendental meditation. Vipassana is much more physical because the version of Vipassana that I learned, you learn body scanning. So you start by focusing on the breath, and then you focus even more specifically on your nose and the part of your face where the breath goes, and you sensitize your skin in that part of your body. I know I'm being a little bit graphic here, but you basically you create the capacity to focus on different parts of your body with the kind of attention that makes it possible to start, say, with your toes, scan upwards through your whole body, the surface of your body, all the way to the crown of your head, and then the next meditation from the top down. Now, my practice is not that elegant. I find that I get caught at different points in my body, but basically that style of meditation for me connects my mind and my body in a way that transcendental meditation didn't.
Did transcendental meditation help prepare you for Vipassana meditation in some way? Did you see a relationship between the two in that way?
Yes. I think that, to be honest, I would recommend meditation in general. I don't think it has to be one kind. I think that the practice of meditation, which almost universally involves focusing the attention or focusing your attention on something, a mantra, your body, your breath, a lot of different styles of meditation focus on the breath. And then there's ways of moving from that into the consideration of how meditation relates to your life and so on and so forth. But transcendental meditation was really intended, I think, at least from my point of view, to make it possible to just relax, reduce tension. As a graduate student, I found that it was a very important asset, and so I practiced it from that point of view. So the experience of being able to focus my attention on a mantra was preparation, in a sense, for being able to focus on my breath and then focus on my body. I've always had I would call something of a spiritual inclination, but these kinds of meditation, I think, do complement each other.
So there was a certain calmness that it helped you sort of cultivate. Also, ability to focus. Is it both of those things?
I think that being able to actually practice is key to being able to get into a space where you feel your body, at least I feel my body relaxing. Mm-hmm. And that sense of calmness. And I will admit that there are some times when I'm practicing Vipassana where I simply fall asleep and I'm dreaming. And I wake up and realize that I've been dreaming, but I don't judge that because it's a way of acknowledging that my body was so relaxed mm-hmm. that I actually just lost consciousness. And it isn't like I wasn't, aware. I mean, the transition from meditation to dreaming is very subtle. And I think it's a pretty important part of just acknowledging the relationship between your body and your mind. Those sorts of things make it possible to practice meditation in such a way that over time, I found that now I look forward to meditating twice a day. And fortunately for me, I have time in my schedule. I know a lot of us are so busy that it's very difficult to do that.
You mentioned the spiritual aspect. Could you speak a little bit more about that? How does this practice relate to spiritual inclination or spiritual? What is the spiritual dimension of focusing on a mantra or focusing on the experience, your present moment experience of your body? How would you explain that to others? How is that?
It's a little hard for me to put it in words. But the way I look at it is the experience of meditating, and in particular now, the experience of letting go of thoughts and feelings and recognizing that the kind of chatter that goes on in our brain is always there. It's sometimes I get a song in my head and it's like an earworm, and then you're stuck with the song until it finally works its way through. The important thing is not to judge that. And so maybe the most important thing is to realize that at a certain point, what you're doing is you're cultivating compassion for yourself. And my own view is that I don't think it's really possible to be compassionate to other creatures unless you also experience compassion for yourself. And so those two things go hand in hand. And the process of meditating and bringing up these things and not judging them, putting them in perspective, as it were, creates space to build an empathy for who you are without judging whether that's good or bad.
So, trying to like reflect back on your practice through the years, through the decades, right? Thinking about it like from a counterfactual perspective, like what do you think how has it impacted you as a person, first off, versus if let's say you didn't practice that? And I know it's kind of it's very difficult to say. Maybe I don't know if it's a fair question, but what could you say that it's given you that we haven't covered so far? Yeah.
Well, it's not entirely, the counterfactual idea is not entirely theoretical, because, I mean, you look at me or look at others, many of us who've practiced and then not practiced and then practiced and then not practiced. It's a single case design. I mean, look at it that way. So, we evolve over time. So you still have rival hypotheses, as it were, but the meditation experience for me is associated with just being able to be calm or more calm, if not during the whole day, at least during the time that I'm meditating. And that's not always the case, but at least there's ways in which you can say to yourself, I'm creating an opportunity to settle down. And it's a physiological thing. I mean, Jon Kabat-Zinn's introduction of mindfulness in the medical teaching field in the United States in the 1970s was all about stress reduction for medical students and medical practitioners. And it's been extremely successful. And, Kabat-Zinn started a whole movement, and it continues to this day in medicine, as well as a whole lot of other professions. And now evaluators are beginning to discover it as well, which totally makes sense. But the whole point of practicing meditation over time, and because I've evolved, it's a very subtle thing. But I'll give you an example that's pretty recent. One of my theoretical interests right now in the evaluation field is how we perceive causes and effects. Now, as evaluators, program effectiveness is central to the work that we do. We have a whole armamentarium of methodologies that are aimed at essentially reducing the amount of uncertainty associated with understanding how a program works, and more importantly, why it works, and so on. All good. But the experience that I'm having now is that rather than try and canvas the different ways that evaluators have conceptualized causality in their written work, I'm trying to understand how I conceptualize causality in my everyday life. How do I know that one thing causes another? And it's a subjective thing. I am just beginning this process, but what I am doing is talking to other people informally, family, friends, trying to find out how they also know something causes something else. And, part of it's evolutionary. I mean, we're designed to be able to perceive causes and effects. But the point I'm making is that meditation has opened the door to being able to actually see the importance of subjectivity in something that eventually I hope will be important for the whole field. I'm not even sure if I'm going to publish something out of this. But I know for me, causality has always been a major focus. I mean, I started my university career in the physical sciences, and the physical sciences, because mathematics, all the other kinds of things that go together with commitment to physical science, cause and effect is just, it's there. And there's a paradigm for it, and when you've got research or experiments and so on and so forth. Evaluation has just become so diverse that the way we see causes and effects as practitioners varies from one group to another. We talk about paradigms, and it fascinates me that we cannot really say that we have a common understanding of what I consider to be one of the most important core kind of questions for evaluators. So all by way of saying is that meditation has opened a door for me to begin a different way of thinking about this.
When you speak to subjectivity, are you speaking now and the diverse sort of understandings of causality? Are you speaking to sort of the ontological aspects or the nature of reality and how that sort of plays in? Is that, or are you speaking more to just the various epistemologies and kind of ways in which we understand, phenomena? We tested those. So yeah, or is that?
Yeah. Well,
is that all relevant? Yeah.
Here we run into, physics, particularly if you look at the way physics is structured. I mean, it's all about equations, and technically speaking, equations do not imply causality. They merely tell you how things are related to other things, and you need to infer causality through the application of different kinds of equations to situations where you can manipulate one thing and something else happens. Or alternatively, you observe the conjunction of things in a situation where you can rule out other causes, and so to speak. Okay, so there is something in the thinking that I'm undertaking right now that is ontological, because I honestly wonder, if we look at reality from a quantum physical point of view, where we are hardwired to be cause and effect. I wouldn't call us machines, but definitely we have a predilection for causes and effects, because that was and still is to some extent a survival mechanism that we have as human beings. That's where we come from. But if you look at quantum physics, where reality is almost entirely a matter of probabilities, and you've got things going on where if you talk about causes and effects, it's not the same thing at all as the kind of understanding of causes and effects that we have in the macro world. So, I don't dwell on that because, frankly, I'm more interested in epistemologies of causes and effects. And so from that point of view, looking at myself subjectively is a matter of saying, so what do I need to have in place to be able to tell whether something causes something else? What are the conditions? And I'm finding that meditation actually opens me up to being able to observe those things in myself without being so tied to the moment, that I can at least begin to see patterns in ways that I don't think I would have been able to see if I hadn't been meditating fairly regularly for these years.
So it gives you a clearer sort of vision or insight into what is occurring. Is that what you're sort of saying, or is it something else?
Well, there is more clarity, but I think that, without belaboring it, not being attached even to my own theoretical speculations or my own observations about causes and effects, makes it possible to see things and at least pay attention to things that I might have missed otherwise.
Okay.
And the other thing that I sort of implied a few moments ago, James, is that this way of looking at a problem in our field is very different from the way I would have approached it before I really got into Vipassana meditation. So instead of canvassing the literature and trying to find out what people are doing, I've evolved something that's more immediate. And then once I get my own grounding, then I will dive into the literature and say, so do I agree with that? Do I disagree with that? And if so, why? So it's more like building a different way of approaching the problem.
Okay, got it. What you were talking about just a moment ago, sort of like openness to various possibilities, kind of limiting or reducing the likelihood of maybe cognitive bias, or at least the different like confirmation bias or disconfirmation bias, other types of biases that present. That's something we write about in our paper. Is that what you're? Is there something there as well, like noticing when we might discount things because they don't necessarily converge or not consistent with what our preconceived notions were? That's something we all do, I think, as human beings, right? But when you're trying to determine cause and effect, if you're closing yourself off to alternative possibilities, alternate data that might suggest other conclusions, then that can be problematic. It can lead you down the wrong path. Is there something there to what I'm saying? Is there something there? Can you maybe speak to that?
Well, look at it this way. I mean, that during the time I was a physical science student, what I took for granted is, in at least some sort of nominal way, you get to see the things that you're manipulating, and you get to actually test relationships that are easily discernible in laboratory experiments. Okay, so observables, they're all around you. Now, science has evolved a lot since I was a beginning student in that, but I think it would be fair to say that the objects that we have as evaluators are far more theoretical and far more difficult to define. And there's lots and lots of evaluators that just resist the whole idea of being able to define and measure aspects of social interactions, social reality. That's one of the whole areas of disputation in our field. So, when you're looking at the kinds of things that we talk about, say, let's just take confirmation bias as an example. I think that because of the work and because of the kinds of theories that we have, given how abstract a lot of the objects and relationships are, really, we come into what I would call an empirical situation with belief systems or beliefs that very often when you are comparing those to data, the comparison isn't exact, and there's so much measurement error, and there's gaps. I've been puzzled to some extent how multiple lines of evidence actually come together to deal with causality, but that's a different issue. But the main point is that I think confirmation bias is a big problem for evaluators. And part of the problem is that we evaluators often find ourselves, when we're working with clients, in situations where there's an expectation particularly by the people who operate programs with whom we have to interact in order to get data, that their programs will be effective. And so I know a lot of evaluation writing that I see now is unabashedly very much in the advocacy domain. The idea being that, you should be trying to find the strengths of programs. Appreciative inquiry would be an example of that whole kind of approach. And the end result is that we can often be captured by patterns of evidence that are consistent with our beliefs, and confirmation bias in that situation is a very real threat to the validity of our work.
So we're thinking about how mindfulness can impact evaluators, which is the subject of the chapter that you will have, and the mindfulness and practical wisdom for evaluators, and then our article, the supporting evaluation practice through mindfulness. Is that an area when we're thinking about if you were to hang a sign and say these are the benefits of mindfulness or meditation practice, this is why you should consider it as to other evaluators, what would be on that list? What would be sort of the benefits that you would imagine? Is it reducing some types of cognitive bias, like confirmation bias, or are there other things as well? Some things that you've spoken about in terms of how it's impacted you, but are there other things that you would suggest or mention?
Yeah, I think that there's two levels to talk about this, James. One is, so I think mindfulness practice opens up possibilities in our heads, in our thought patterns. It creates space to look at our own thoughts and patterns, to be reflective. That's critical. I think that mindfulness is a very important tool to develop what I call self-reflective capacity in not only our professional work, but our personal work. But it's not sufficient. I think that if we're talking about ameliorating things like confirmation bias, we need to recognize that if we work alone, we are going to be more likely to be captured by our biases than if we work in teams. Now, I know lots of evaluations are done by small groups of people who, are in the same company or the same organization. Some of the work that I've done has been solo work, where the expectation by the client is that somehow, even if I don't say my work is objective, that it will be authoritative. And I actually feel uneasy about that, because I think that what we need to be prepared to do, and mindfulness actually helps, is to have our ideas, our conclusions, our perceptions of cause and effect relationships, if you want, challenged by others. Now, it doesn't have to be adversarial, but it has to be done in such a way that you are prepared to acknowledge that you missed something, that you may have been wrong, that there are other ways in which you could see things that would be more fulsome in relation to a particular engagement. So all by way of saying is that, mindfulness, I think, is an important way of opening the door, but the way we do evaluation is more than just relying on mindfulness. We need to be prepared to acknowledge that as human beings, we're always going to be tempted to draw our own conclusions, and in the absence of feedback, we can get ourselves into situations where the work we do is just not credible.
So to encourage that's discourage or that don't entail sort of groupthink, where there's some challenging, where there's some questioning of data, findings, interpretations. That's a helpful thing. So having others to work with as an evaluator is evaluation teams can be a helpful aspect. It sounds like you're saying. Are there other benefits related to mindfulness for evaluators? Anything else you can think about more broadly, even, or any other things that are worth mentioning?
Well, what I want to do, James, is just connect mindfulness to a Greek notion, practical wisdom. Now, mindfulness is, I would say, it's beginning to make inroads into our field. The article that you published in the AJE in 2022 was well done, and it made a difference to, I think, the way that people in our whole field will now see mindfulness. So instead of it being on the fringe, it is now something that people are going to say, well, maybe this is something that we ought to consider, particularly if we have aspirations for being a proto profession. So that's one thing. So mindfulness encourages reflection, self-reflection, mindfulness. I think, frankly, if you practice it, encourages humility. One of the important things for me as a practitioner is what I call beginner's mind. You don't judge any meditation by some standard. You just go with what it is that you're trying to do. That doesn't mean that you just fall asleep every time, but the whole point is that there's ways of approaching your own practice that carry over into how we think about the work that we do professionally. So, practical wisdom, of course, is bigger than that. But basically, practical wisdom fundamentally is about ethical action. And the important thing about practical wisdom, at least the way people talk about it now, Aristotle's view has been superseded to some extent, but now what we think of as practical wisdom is, so how do we practice in such a way that when we make a decision, we're taking into account not only our craft, the skills, the methodologies, and so on and so forth that we have as evaluators, or any professional for that matter, and the idea of somehow melding that with an ethical stance so that you're making the right decision for the right reasons in that particular context. Now, it sounds sort of magical. And one of the challenges, I think, of practical wisdom is that we very much don't yet know how to measure it in its fulsome way. But for me, connecting mindfulness to sort of the grounding of skills, knowledge, even a worldview that is consistent with practical wisdom makes a whole lot of sense.
I'm looking forward to reading that chapter. I don't have that book yet, but I'm going to get it and looking forward. I haven't seen that chapter yet, so I'm looking forward to that. Working with different programs, program staff, other evaluators, are there aspects to mindfulness practice or different techniques or practices that you've ever used or incorporated in your interactions? There's an article on excessive evaluation anxiety that we cite in our paper, right? That phenomenon where a lot of times the clients, the individuals we're working with are running the programs, they get sort of, very anxious about the whole process of working with an evaluator, being evaluated. Has mindfulness, kind of what we're talking about generally, if it's mindfulness or something otherwise, has it emerged sort of in how you work with with others, and not just in terms of your own, how you bring yourself to the experience or interaction, but in terms of how you might structure interactions, or how you might work, ways in which you would kind of lead or run workshops, sessions, working sessions, that kind of thing. So is there anything there that you've used or thought about using?
Well, I will say this, that when I'm thinking about interacting with others, particularly in evaluation situations, and I agree with you. I think that there is very definitely something called evaluation anxiety. And, one of the challenges of our field is balancing the need to get at what's really going on with the fears, anxieties of the people with whom we're interacting. Maybe not the clients, but definitely the people whose programs or policies are being evaluated / judged.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how do you mitigate that? Well, there's a very simple thing, and it doesn't necessarily need to be connected with mindfulness, but I find that it is, in fact, an attribute of mindfulness, and that is just listening, being able to be in the moment, listening to people in such a way that you convey a sincere wish to understand what it is they're saying, paying attention not only to their words, but also all the other kinds of cues and so on and so forth, and doing that in a way that's respectful and doesn't convey that you're just basically confirming your own suspicions. So again, it's open-mindedness. It has to do with a spirit that, people who do qualitative research in particular understand this. But I think evaluators, when they put on a hat of, I'm coming in and I'm going to make pronouncements about your program, for me, the problem that we have as evaluators is the perception by a lot of people that all the work that we do is summative. And really, most of the work that we do is formative. It's intended to improve things. But when you tell people that, it's not enough. You need to convey that by your own behavior, by your own actions, and by your interactions with other people.
So you model it through a real, through your experience with them, through really your interactions, how you communicate with them, really hearing them. Yeah, I've noticed with myself when I worked as a therapist, and now that I work with different organizations and so forth as an evaluator. My training as a counselor, I would notice my own kind of judgments, my thoughts, my sort of my all those things going on in my head and how they've affected me, and just sort of noticing those and then kind of letting them pass has been it's been a challenge, but it's quite an eye opener for me, or it's been an eye opener for me, and it's been something that's it's an ongoing practice. It's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
Noticing my own sort of preconceived notions, the judgments that I might come to just in a conversation with somebody in this kind of context. It's so ubiquitous, it's so constant, and it requires just a constant, like a vigilance almost, or awareness of it.
Yes. Yeah, I think one of the things about our whole field is the tension between this kind of role that we have as evaluators to judge. Now that goes right back to Michael Scriven. What do evaluators do that's quintessentially about evaluation? Well, we make judgments of merit and worth, and other people have added significance, but the point is you make judgments. And And those judgments involve comparing, they involve some sort of implicit either yes, you made the grade or no, you didn't make the grade. But that stance, being a judge, is, I think, really fundamentally different from the stance that you take as a practitioner of mindfulness, where you don't judge. You don't judge yourself. You don't judge your own thoughts. And by, implication, through compassion, through empathy, you're not judging other people. So there's ways in which I think it influences not only our own view of ourselves, but also our interpersonal behavior professionally.
Let me ask you, someone, younger evaluators or just other evaluators who might be hearing this or kind of coming across this, some of these ideas, what are some areas where would you maybe suggest people start if they're interested in doing some kind of practice that enhances mindfulness or exploring this in some way, just kind of dipping the toes into this? What are some ideas you have around that, or any recommendations you might have?
The chapter that Anna Coughlin and I co-authored that is in this book.
Yes.
This has just been published, and I would recommend it because not only does it offer evaluators some practical advice if you want to get into understanding the practice of mindfulness, but it also situates mindfulness as a sort of what I would call North American or at least neo-Western movement. So that would be one place to start. The other source of information is a series of articles by the Russons, Russon. Now, they appeared in the Interdisciplinary Journal of Evaluation, the online journal, the open version. And they were really started from 2008, went to 2012 or 13. And we reference those in the chapter that Anna and I co-authored. And those articles are a little more discursive because that approach to mindfulness is more self-consciously connecting mindfulness to its spiritual and religious roots. Whereas the chapter that we co-authored is more about, let's treat it as a secular kind of movement that can make a difference to the evaluation field. It certainly made a difference to medicine and a variety of other professions. So that would be one source that I would recommend.
In terms of starting to do some kind of practice, are there any, if someone was starting out, would you say to try Vipassana practice or a transcendental meditation or other type of practice, or is it just kind of, are there suggestions around, resources for personal practice too that you might have?
Yeah, I would recommend. Now, here's a connection that is a little more lateral. One of the things that I was surprised by was reading Yuval Noah Harari's books, Homo sapien, or Sapiens, and Homo Deus. And I read those books without knowing that he's a practitioner of Vipassana meditation, has been for 20 years. And those books, I think, are, from at least from my point of view, an essential read.
Yeah.
You want to understand how what I call Western society, a really global society, is going to evolve in the presence of artificial intelligence and our increasing kind of mastery of technology. But the real problem is the absence of values and goals for humanity. And so I read those books and I thought to myself, this person is an alien. I mean, it's like the perspective on humanity and the way that we're evolving was almost as if it were written by someone who's standing outside the human race. And then lo and behold, he dedicates the books to his guru in Vipassana meditation. And I thought to myself, well, there is something there. So, it's not a recommendation that is intended to kind of get you into practice, but those two books, from my point of view, are an essential read if we want to try and understand the implications of the evolution of our kind of culture, science-based approach to reality that is now dominating the whole planet.
Yeah, I think he practices 2 hours a day and goes on retreat every year. And when I saw that too, it was interesting how he references that as kind of it gives him that perspective and sharp sort of like insight, and ability to study and present some really lucid ideas and a greater sort of understanding of where we are as humanity and how we got here and where we're potentially going. Yeah. Well, great. Did you have any questions for me as we kind of wrap up? I know that through our email, you mentioned you might have some questions for me, but if you do, that's great. If not, that's all right too. But I wanted to open that up as well before we wrap up.
Well, I've appreciated our conversation, James. I had made some notes to myself, but there's a point where you just kind of launch into things. And so we've done that. I will add one more thing for myself, and this is, again, a connection with mindfulness. I'm more and more concerned as a human being and as an evaluator about the impacts of climate change. And so work that I'm doing with a colleague here at the University of Victoria, her name is Astrid Bruxelles, we're trying to understand possible ways in which evaluation as a field can be transformed to focus more explicitly on what we call global health. And the kinds of values that are embodied in that view of our field are, in my way of thinking, broadly consistent with what I call mindfulness thinking. So I'll just make that connection. And, I'm curious about you. How long have you been practicing, and what form of meditation are you practicing for yourself?
Yeah, well, first off, I appreciate you mentioning that. And if there's some articles or some kind of references about the work that you're doing, I can put it in the show notes, so I can share. My own practice is about 7 years ago. I started basically a Vipassana practice, and the last kind of 2 years, it's been more focusing on awareness itself. So the object is sort of, rather than an external object like breath or the body or just experience, focusing on awareness itself. So that's been my practice. Really, just 20 minutes a day, so not very long. I've gone to one retreat, but it's helped me a lot. It's helped me in terms of, over the years, in terms of just a calmness, or like emotionally, it's helped. And then I have this sort of a kind of an ADHD kind of proclivity or whatever. So that it's helped with my ability to focus too. So those have been two things that's supported in the literature a bit, and or quite a bit. And so it's been helpful from that perspective in my own life. And I use it in my evaluation work more in terms of like how it impacts me and how I come to an experience, to an interaction, an encounter, rather than leading formal. Like in the article that my colleagues mentioned, some of the stuff that they do when they have different workshops and different run sessions with clients or evaluate with administrators, folks who run programs, and so forth, stakeholders. For me, it's more about just sort of my own development, and then bringing myself fully to the experience. And yeah, that's really it. And I see myself sort of very much in the beginning part, and that's an evolving kind of a thing that I'm learning more about. And I've had periods of time where I'll meditate more and other times less, but I typically do it every day. And also trying to bring like that mindfulness practice outside of formal meditation, so that when I'm just washing the dishes or going on a walk, trying to bring that there. So not just a meditation, but also outside of it as well. Yeah. So that's
well said. Beginner's mind is very important. I don't think that I will ever get beyond that. I don't think of my commitment as some sort of a ladder. I think it's more lateral, and who knows where it will lead. I do find it curious how people make a commitment to the whole lifestyle where you eventually become a monk or a nun. I've known some people who really their aspiration in life is to become completely committed to the kind of Buddhist practice that they are a part of. And I look at those folks and frankly, I admire them, because to be able to sort of step away from all the things that capture us in our work and our daily lives is pretty amazing. I'm not that kind of person, but I do understand the value of being able to let go of things periodically.
Well, Jim, this has been a great discussion. Maybe we'll have a TIG form on contemplative practice, or got to work on that, or a mindfulness or something like that. We can have something that's maybe this will sort of catch on with AA. We'll see what will happen.
Yeah.
But thanks very much for talking with me. The time kind of flew by for me, and look forward to talking more, staying in touch.
All right. Thank you, James.